Broady, fully back here with you once again. Sorry about the picture qualities on my phone. I don't really have a camera phone set up, and I was trying to do audio wise, it was just getting annoying. So I just decided to do it through my phone. So this is going to be a response to Nate Broady, aka Multiple Personalities, links down below, and his ongoing disagreement with the YouTube user Steve Mcrae about the definition of atheism. Now, for those who didn't see, there was a debate recently on Modern Day Debates, link down below. To both Modern Day Debates and the debate between Steve Mcrae and Snake, in which Nate Broady did give him some. Now, the thing is that Nate Broady made some mistakes in both the debate with Snake and in his video, which I have coming up. Now, Nate, this is not something against you. You just made some mistakes. Now, these are not unique to you. There was another user who made the same mistakes you do, and I'm just going to walk you through them. Now, hopefully, you'll respond to this, and you'll take this in the mid that I'm trying to educate. And I don't necessarily agree with Steve or agree with yourself. I'm just disagreeing. So, with that said, let's get to it.
When I first started here online, I started in a philosophical community. In that community, we discussed whether God existed, was atheism something that was viable. Today we're going to look at the claim that the consensus in philosophy is that atheism is a belief that gods don't exist. Now we're also going to look at the evidence to support this assertion and the tactics used to deceive our community. Now, if you believed that atheism in philosophy was the belief that no gods exist, and you believe that was a consensus, it's okay. They even fooled me. Okay, welcome back to the channel. My name is Nate, and when I first started here online, I started in a philosophical community. In that community, we discussed whether God existed, was atheism something that was viable. Like, we had a lot of great conversations, but we stopped being critical of each other as we became friends. So when people started making assertions, we stopped challenging them. And one of the biggest assertions that we did not challenge or we did not research was the assertion that in philosophy, atheism is the belief that gods do not exist. And then that was the consensus in philosophy. So this video is going to look at that claim, look at the support used for that claim, and see if we can determine if that claim is just nonsense or if it's a claim that is legitimate. Now, what's interesting, my grandmother always said, a wise man can never know enough, but a fool knows everything. And I want you to think about that as we go through this process. I want you to try to be humble about absorbing the information and just be open-minded to the information I'm presenting to you. Now, to start our evaluation, we have to start with the claim. What is the claim? Well, Steve Mcrae has been saying for the past 5 years that the consensus in philosophy is that atheism is a belief that no gods exist. Here's a tweet where Steve memorialized it. Quote, "There is a consensus on how the word should be understood to mean in philosophy. Meaning, if you are reading a paper, it is most commonly understood, overwhelmingly so, to mean a belief that gods do not exist. Sorry, this is just a fact. And facts don't care about your fifis." And Steve also says this during most of his debates that he has on the topic. Here's one example.
As best understood in philosophy, almost ubiquitously, atheism is the belief that there are no gods, or that theism is false, or the rejection of theism, or the disbelief of theism, which means...
No, I disagree with you.
Now, the first evidence that Steve has presented that I want to see if we can untangle is this claim that he has found papers in philosophy that use atheism in the positive sense. And because he has a large enough sample size that he can extrapolate that the majority of papers in philosophy hold atheism to be the belief that no gods exist. Listen to this clip.
So how many papers do you have that use it in your way as compared to how many papers do you have that don't use it your way and use it my way? I can produce, right now, if I have to, I can produce at least 6 papers instantly that use it the way I have? How many papers do you have that use it the way you use it?
Now, just to be clear, I went on Google Scholar and just searched for atheism and religion to see how many papers are out there that actually just use the word atheism in philosophy. And the search results came out with 143 papers that use the term atheism in a religious context on Google Scholar. So Steve is using a sample size of 6 papers. Let's make it 12. Let's double it just to be fair. And contends that proves the majority of the philosophical literature uses atheism.
Nate, you can't really assume what these papers say. We need to actually read them. We need to actually read the context to see what they're actually saying, because some are actually arguing for atheism, like, for example, the paper you listed above. It depends on what exactly the context is. We need to see what it's applying to, with what argument it's going to lead to, what building blocks it's playing, because again, it could be part of a larger work, which is a establishment of atheism in a certain context. So again, we can't just make assumptions. We actually have to do the research and reading. Now, that's going to be expensive because most of them are very expensive. But again, we'll get into that in a moment. So yes, well, you are correct that again, we can't base consensus based upon just such small numbers, 12. 6 or 12. Again, we can't make assumptions of what 140,000 citations are going to read, or that they're going to indeed support your position. We actually need to read them. I'll look into them and see what the key terms are, and see what their actual context are, because those are important. Now, I'm not saying that I'm right or wrong. I'm just saying that this is important when discussing any sort of academic field, because again, we could just be looking up fields and it could be really how atheism and religion are not really compatible or whatever. You could be making all sorts of arguments. Again, we don't know until we actually read the papers.
In the positive sense, 6 papers out of 140,000. This seems to be flat earth logic. And again, if you're kind of confused about how did this go unnoticed, I believe this claim also. So, I don't think 6 out of 140,000 makes a consensus or even makes it normative, but we can disagree on that point. So I believe this first argument is clearly debunked, right? Let's give him 50 papers that use it the way he says it uses it. I don't think 50 is a large enough sample size of 140,000 different papers and articles to really give us a gauge of what's the overwhelming consensus in philosophy. He could have just cherry picked his 6 papers. How do we know? We would need someone to actually have gone through the literature and say, okay, well, this seems to be a consensus, or this seems not to be a consensus. And just a hint for later, we do have an article in which they did go through the past 10 years of philosophical literature.
I agree in that the book that you cited seemed to be very professional, with it being from Oxford and everything, but we shouldn't assume it's consensus. We actually read it. It's probably going to be very expensive with it being an academic books and everything. They usually go for about 200, 300 quid. I don't know what that is, does. I think it's about like $500. Alright. The point you're making is good one, but we need to understand where the argument started for Steve Mcrae. Now, for those of us who remember Ozymandias, Ramses II, he made an argument about the burden of justification. Now, the thing is, Steve Mcrae heard this argument and has latched onto it like a pit bull, and will not release it. So this is where the origins of this discussion go from, and he's trying to go around and find anything in philosophy to justify that position, instead of being the position which it should be, which is, if you come to a discussion, the burden of proof is above you to present your positions as best you can, to argue in good faith, and again to go forward and provide the justification for your own position. It is not on if you come through it with a bad attitude of I'm not justifying myself. Well, again, you're going to start off on a bad foot anyway. So again, if you come to any discussion with an open mind and open to, hey, maybe I can have my mind change or whatever, good intentions, then that's awesome. But Steve McCrae's dogmatic way of going through it is totally not academic at all. So him citing any sources is laughable to me. But anyway, continue.
To determine if there is a consensus in philosophy. But that's a little later. Now we have to look at the support used for the claim. For the claim that in philosophy, the consensus, the overwhelming consensus, is that atheism is defined as the belief that gods do not exist. Now, Steve repeatedly cites a whole bunch of sources, and a lot of them don't agree with what he actually maintains. But two, he cites more than most. The first is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
And I go by Stanford more than anything.
And the second is Dr. Malik, who is a chemical engineer and who has written a paper on defining atheism.
All your sources from academic philosophers?
Yes.
Dr. Malik has a degree in philosophy?
No, but he has a published paper in a philosophical journal.
So now that leads us to a talk that we have to have. How do you evaluate sources in philosophy? Now, this is where I have to give credit where credit is due. I would have never even thought to research how you evaluate sources in philosophy unless I was doing this particular takedown video. Where am I getting my information from? Well, I went to both Cornell University and Princeton University's library page, and there they have a specific section about how to evaluate sources in philosophy to determine if they're credible or not. Now, both Ivy League institutions have a two-step approach. First, they have what they call the initial appraisal, and then they have the content analysis. So in the initial appraisal, you have to look at things like the author, the date of publication, what edition or has there been any revisions, the publisher, and the title of the journal. And then when you look within the content, you look to see what the intended audience were, what the objective reasoning is, the coverage, writing style, and last but not least, evaluative reviews. Now, both Cornell and Princeton say the same exact thing. In your initial appraisal of the work, you want to really focus in on the author. You want to see what the author's credentials are. You want to see what institutions they're affiliated with. You want to look at the author's educational background, their past writings, their experience in the field. If this book or article is written within the author's area of expertise. Now, these are some things that you want to determine to see if this author has the requisite knowledge to even talk about the topic. Now, there's another way that you can appraise the value of the author's work is through citations. And both Princeton and Cornell say you should see if the author is cited in other sources and bibliographies. Now, the reason for this, as cited on their website, is that respected authors are cited frequently amongst other scholars. And, quote, for this reason, always note the names that appear in different sources. That's because they're more valuable to the field. Now, when you look at the content analysis portion of the review, being cited is also important there. Now, this is because you want to see if the work has been critically reviewed. If no one's citing this work, and if no one reviewing this work, it's likely not credible.
Not really, no. So let's go to what you just cited, which is Stanford. Now, again, they shouldn't really have said the number citation because, again, what is actually cited in books, not necessarily articles themselves. Because you see, the articles themselves are what leading to the books. Because usually the books are collations of peer-reviewed articles that, again, are collated into a book, and that is what's cited. It isn't necessarily the works, the papers themselves, because you don't do the same thing in philosophy as you do in... But and actually, there's people who disagree with you, Nate. I'm just gonna speak out there. I'm gonna post some below where somebody just says they don't do the peeing cow thing. And there's somebody else who made the exact same mistake you just did, which was Thunderfoot, in which he compared himself to William Lane Craig, and he compared how many times he'd been cited. But again, it's number of citations could be for a number of reasons. People don't really have arguments against what he's put in, because that's usually when people are cited, is when they're arguing against the positions they're holding. It doesn't not necessarily in a positive manner. So again, it depends. There's a lot of factors in that. So again, we can't just use citation. It depends on what they're citing for. what's the context that they're citing for? Again, you can't just use they are citing person X, therefore their work is credible. That is faulty logic, especially within philosophy. So, continue.
And not useful if you're trying to do scholarly work. Now, there can be what I like to call cross-discipline authors. Now, these are authors that may not be academic philosophers, but have written papers that can influence the field. Now, this is where citations become important. Because, see, remember, respected authors are cited frequently by other scholars. The more an author's work is cited, the more influential that work is on the greater field. Now, an author who has not been cited by anyone in the field is a far less credible source. Now, this point about cited sources is not just true in philosophy, it's also true for other disciplines like astrophysics. King Crocodile did a video showing how creationists have a tactic to mislead the public about particular scientists who have work that's not cited in the field and who haven't contributed to their field, but just use the label of being a doctor or PhD to try to spread misinformation. So he looks at Lawrence Krauss, who's been cited over 1,500 times, versus creationist Russell Humphreys, who's only been cited 26 times. And listen to what King Crocodile says about the quality of both of their work.
Russell Humphreys, the physicist champion of creationism. Here are the numbers. Publications, 11. That's an average of about 1 publication every 4 years since he got his PhD. Citations from other scientists, which is an indicator of how much of an effect his work has had on his field, 26. That makes the average number of citations for his work less than 3, or about 0.59 per year. But as bad as this looks, it only gets worse when we look at the raw data. Of his 11 publications, only 7 have any citations. The rest have 0 citations, meaning that they've had no impact whatsoever on the field.
So let's look at Steve's source that is not a philosopher, that is not an academic philosopher. Now, this is Dr. Malik. Dr. Malik is a chemical engineer, and his paper, Defining Atheism and a Burden of Proof, has been cited none. This paper has not been cited in the field. It's been out for about 2 years, and it has not been reviewed, it has not been cited. So, there are a couple of conclusions we can draw. This is not a respected author. No one in the field has cited his work or reviewed his content. This paper would not be considered a good source by any stretch of the imagination. Now, we can compare that to Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion. Now, Richard Dawkins is not an academic philosopher.
Okay, I had to stop. Okay, God Delusion is not a philosophical work. Just because he was cited that moment doesn't mean all those are positive. Probably a lot of those were negative. I think it was Richard Dawkins himself who said that a dog should not be concerned with how many fleas it has, or something along those lines. But that's not the least of your problems. The second problem is that King Crocodile is talking about science, not philosophy. Science, the reason citations are key is because you're going off past work and past. The reason people cite your work is because not only is it influential, but it's also helping them to achieve more work in their field. For example, if I'm doing works on genetics or something like that, I need to be cited because, again, therefore my work is promoting more work in that field. Because, again, even if I fail at something, I get cited, it means that somebody's done what I done, realised what I did wrong, and then corrected it and then did it right. So if it was onto a good thing, it's the same thing. So again, you can't just use citation because, again, it depends what the citation is. What's it citing? Why is it citing it? What context is it citing it? Those things are key. Whereas science is not necessary. If you're getting cited, it means that you've either failed or succeeded, and people are using your work. So again, you can't compare across fields like that. It just doesn't work.
Philosopher, he's a biologist, and The God Delusion, which is his work, has been cited over 6,000 times within the field. So if you want to compare the two, you can see there is absolutely no comparison. One author has been massively cited while the other one has no citations. Just for shits and giggles, Dr. Malik cites Richard Dawkins within his paper. So when it comes to which one of these authors is taken more seriously within the world of philosophy, there's no question. It's Richard Dawkins. So look at this exchange between Steve and Snake on Modern Day Debate about Richard Dawkins and Dr. Malik, and which one of these authors is more respected in the field of philosophy.
His paper has in a strong case. Moser has in a strong case. What paper do you have that has it in the weak case?
Well, there's Martin, Fluke, Latour, McGrath, Eller, Dillard, Harris, Hitchens, Dennett, Dawkins, Hume.
No. We're talking philosophers, okay?
So Steve's objection is, hold on, we're talking philosophers. Get this biologist out of here, right? He's not a philosopher.
They're all philosophers.
No, Dawkins is not a philosopher. He's a biologist.
Now, mind you, Dawkins has been cited over 6,000 times. His work in philosophy is probably one of the most cited pieces of literature out there. And Steve is dismissing it because he's a biologist.
Anyone can be a philosopher.
Well, he does if he wants to. If he has a philosophical paper, which I don't think that he does.
Now, mind you, again, his own source, Dr. Malik, cites Dawkins. So at this point, he is calling into the question his own reference, the reference of his source. He's now calling into question.
You're wrong here, and I'll point out why. Dr. Malik also cites the Oxford English Dictionary. Does that mean the English Dictionary is a philosophical work? No, he's just using it to make a point against what he's presenting in the article. Now, again, I've not read the article. It's about 20 quid worth. I might spend 20 quid to go and read it to see what he actually says and see if he actually agrees with what Mr. Mcrae is saying here. Now, again, I do agree with you that I think Steve is overstating his position here, and he should maybe actually read these articles and actually come to a more general consensus of what he's saying than just going off works again. It sounds like you've done a lot with like Dennett and Martin Flew and stuff like that. And again, you shouldn't just dismiss them. You should, again, some of these like Dennett, for example, is a philosopher. Martin Flew is a philosopher. You should actually go and read. You should actually go and read them. So I think that him just going, dismissing the argument out of hand is wrong. But again, it's Steve Mcrae, what to expect.
But Flew says very specifically.
So are all your sources from academic philosophers?
Yeah.
That is a good question. I'm going to wind it back so we can hear it again.
Flew says very specifically.
So are all your sources from academic philosophers?
Now, let's stop here. What would the answer be? Now, the answer obviously is going to be no, because we know Dr. Malik is not an academic philosopher. But Steve, in his haste to try to deceive the audience, listen to what he says.
But Flew says very specifically.
So are all your sources from academic philosophers?
Yes.
Now, we know that's not true. Now, watch how Snake, which I think is brilliant, closes the door.
Dr. Malik has a degree in philosophy?
Now, this is a very good question because Snake came prepared. Dr. Malik is not an academic philosopher. You've portrayed him to be, but we know that now. So now let's see how Steve gets out of this box.
No, but he has a published paper in a philosophical journal.
With zero.
You don't have to have a PhD and to have it be published.
So you see how the special pleading is now working. Dawkins, who is cited 6,000 times, can be dismissed because of two reasons. One, he doesn't agree with Steve's point. And two, because he's not a philosopher. But for the philosopher that agrees with his point, for the non-academic philosopher that agrees with his point, I should say, Dr. Malik, he's accepted even though he has been cited 0 times within the field.
Yeah, he's published. It is peer-reviewed.
It has not been reviewed by anybody.
Oh, no. It is peer-reviewed. Sorry to correct you, but if it's published by the Cambridge Academic Press, it is. University Press, it is peer-reviewed. To get in there is peer-reviewed. What do you mean the citation? I think you misspoke here. But I'll give you that point that you probably misspoke.
with 0 citations?
What is that? Yes,
from Google Scholar. I mean, you cite it.
Now, I think this is the most telling part of this exchange. Steve just doesn't understand why citations matter, why his sources' work being cited by other scholars matters in philosophy. He has not looked at these sources and done a critical review of their worth in the field. He's just cherry picking different sources and seeing one that agrees with his point and then holding that source up like a battering ram and tries to hammer his opponents with that source. But Steve is using a source that is not credible in the field of philosophy just because he agrees with his point. So just to be clear, Dr. Malik cites Richard Dawkins and Steve rejects Dawkins. So he is essentially rejecting his own sources' references. This is where it has come to. Steve is saying that the person he's holding up as an authority is wrong because he referenced a biologist. Again, if Dawkins can be dismissed, then it seems like Dr. Malik's paper can be dismissed also because he points to Dawkins as a reference. But now, let's look at Steve's academic sources. And the one that he points to by far is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Now, that's written by Professor Paul Draper, and it's been cited within the field about 18 times. Now, there's another book called the Oxford Handbook on Atheism. Now, there's an article in there by Stephen Bullivant, and it's called Defining Atheism. And that article has been cited 68 times. Matter of fact, that article is so well known that Draper cites it at Stanford, and even Dr. Malik cites it within his work too. So this work is cited by both of Steve's sources. Now, if you combine the sources, the God Delusion and the Handbook from Oxford, you have 6,355 different times it's been cited within the field. Where if you look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and Dr. Malik, you only have 18 times that it's been cited within the field. So here is Snake now confronting Steve about how poor the works that he's using to support his argument are being cited.
Strong. I have no evidence for this.
So let's look at the normativity of your definition. So Dr. Malik has 0 citations. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has 18 citations. Dr. Oppie has 1 citation. So
I don't see why citations have anything to do with it. They're still peer-reviewed papers, and I go by Stanford more than anything.
This is why you have to do your research for yourself. Now, Steve has been going around with this argument for 4 years, and he doesn't understand why citations are important.
Yes, citations are important, but again, they shouldn't be the be-all and all, because as I said before, and I'll say again, it depends what they're citing for, what context, why they're citing for, because it could be in a negative sense. So again, you should never use how many times a thing has been cited for worthiness. You know, why has it been cited? In what context? You know, is there a reason it's been cited? Now, I've looked up how many times he's been cited. He's been cited quite a lot of times himself. Now again, I don't know where you got the info for how many times this paper's been cited, because I looked all over for that information and I couldn't find it on any of the pages from Cambridge, from philosophy prof, from any of the places where it is. So again, I'd just like to know where you got this information from, because he could have been cited for any number of these things for any number of reasons. So again, it's on numerous sources, not just on one. It's mainly published on Cambridge, but again, it's Cambridge. It published on numerous other states. So again, even though Steve's wrong, that's again like you should never use 1 or 2 sources to confirm your theory on anything. You're incorrect in saying that citations are key in philosophy. They're not. Again, not necessarily the work itself. The actual books, yes. That's why you should point to the book on the handbook for atheism. That being more worthy, especially the article that you label below. I think that does blow a very big hole in his argument. But again, him being cited on its own, because again, we don't know if it's going to be transferred into a book again of maybe Islamic apology or into dismantling some arguments against the burden of proof or justification in a philosophical sense. Again, it was only published a few months ago, so we don't know what else is going on. We don't know if there's more work to be done yet. Again, with these things, so saying that citation is important, no, not necessarily, because it depends. So again, you use Stanford, but again, if you actually look at our philosophers, they don't necessarily agree with you, Nate.
He doesn't understand why the work that these people are doing is important. He just doesn't understand that being cited by other authors in the field of philosophy is important. Now again, this is not me saying that they're important. This is Princeton. This is Cambridge. This is Cornell. This is how you evaluate sources in philosophy. This is standard. And Steve doesn't know this. So what has happened is that he is using sources that aren't as credible as he thinks they are and using them as this holy grail. But he just doesn't understand that you have to evaluate your sources.
I slightly agree with you, but using citation is a really lazy way of doing that. In science, it's important to measure it that way because, again, to see how much somebody is influential in their field, how much their work is being used to produce other work, is important. In philosophy, it doesn't work that way. And again, if you go on I'm going to sound more smart than I am, trust me. But if you go to JSTOR or you go to Chicago or you go on any other word, is the work appearing on there? Again, you keep on Cambridge. It was printed in the Cambridge University Press date. That makes it a peer-reviewed work. You may not agree with it. I may not agree with it. Again, but you are right. Shouldn't we actually look at the work and invest on its own merits? We shouldn't just say just because it's not cited therefore it's not good work. That is really faulty logic. Because again, you cannot compare science to philosophy. The number of citations does not, especially in a paper, does not promote how useful it is. I mean, and this is not me defending Steve at all. I think his argument's wrong because, again, I think it's a personal thing what you believe and don't. But the logic you're using is wrong, unfortunately. And I know, again, I'm not saying that I'm any sort of this, but I just have a degree in the humanities. That's the reason I know about this crap.
Critically. And unfortunately, he has not. And so at the end of the day, if you look at Steve's sources and how well they're cited within the field of philosophy, the two sources that he holds most dear, the ones that define atheism as a belief, have just been cited 18 times within the field. And the two sources that Snake was using in his arguments have been cited over 6,000 times in the field, and they define atheism as a lack of belief. So whose sources would you consider to be more credible? Think about it. And this gets even worse, because if you add Dr. Oppie's 5 citations to the mix, then that only brings you up to 23 times where Steve has pointed to papers that define atheism as a belief. This is what happens when you don't understand how to properly evaluate the sources that you're citing. And if I just remove Richard Dawkins' book, the article defining atheism in the Oxford Handbook of Atheism has been cited about 3 times more than all 3 of his sources combined. And again, they define it as a lack of belief. So now we have to return to the claim that there is a consensus within philosophy that atheism is the belief that gods do not exist. So I'm going to use Bullivant's paper defining atheism. Now, in this article, Bullivant and his colleagues looked at about 10 years of what they call serious scholarly writings, and have found that, well, you know what? Let me just read it. Quote, even today, there is no clear academic consensus on how exactly the term should be used. For example, consider the following definitions of atheism or atheist, all taken from serious scholarly writings in the last 10 years. And then he lists them. And as you can see, some are using a strong case, some are using a weak case. Matter of fact, based on this, there are more instances of where serious scholarly writers are using atheism in the weak sense than in Steve's positive sense. So this is a clear refutation of Steve's argument. There is no consensus. They've looked at the data, and Bullivant has said there is no consensus. What happened when Steve was confronted with this fact? Well, now this is where we turn to deception. So now on May 4th, Steve claims that he never said there was a consensus. And he also agreed that there is no consensus in philosophy. Now, obviously, you're probably a little surprised because you've seen the tweets and you've heard him say these things before. But because now he's been presented with the refutation, he now has to say that he never said there's a consensus in philosophy.
Atheism is generally held as the belief that God does not exist. That's pretty standard. I don't know any
It's
philosopher
actually
you know
not.
that would say otherwise.
There is no clear academic consensus to this.
Consensus, but I've never claimed a consensus.
So you see how deceptive he's being. He says he's never claimed a consensus because obviously he's seen this and he sees that it refutes his claim. But the internet never forgets. Randolph Richardson, and he's president of the Canadian Atheist Association, he has been having the same argument with Steve. And he pulled up a screenshot of Steve directly saying that there is a consensus in philosophy. Matter of fact, Steve has said it on video. Steve has said it in tweets. Steve always used to say that there's a consensus in philosophy. And Steve was slammed with this fact. Here is a tweet. What are you talking about? You said there is, and capitalized is to make the point, a consensus on how the word should be understood to mean in philosophy. Close quote, right? He has said this. This is not like this is something new. This is not a straw man. This is what was said. And now, to his fans, he's saying that he did not say this. Now, I don't think it could be any clearer that Steve is trying to deceive the audience and deceive us all by saying he didn't say something that he actually said. So, now being confronted with this fact that he has been claiming this for the past 5 years, and it's been refuted by someone who's actually looked at the papers, who's looked at the evidence and said, no, there is no consensus, an academic source. Let's see how Steve now changes the narrative.
Shift $50. You said atheism equals belief in this consensus in 2018. No, what I said was, and again, this is dishonesty in action here. Randolph was very dishonest in this, and a very dishonest lawyer has been very dishonest about this. What I said was in 2018 in a tweet, there's a consensus upon the normative usage if you're going to read a paper that is best understood as in the positive case. The reason being why is over half the papers are used in the positive case. Matter of fact, everyone I've ever read, I think. I can't recall a paper that uses it in the negative.
So now Steve claims that over half the papers use atheism in the positive sense. He provides no source. He provides no citation. He just makes this up.
Said he didn't even come up with it. It came from Ozzy, and he even mischaracterizes what Ozzy said. Again, he's like a bull with a bulb with this thing. I don't know why. I mean, I think you're right to nail me with this. Now he's starting to back away from the claim. Again, I'm not going to say which side is right, which side wrong. Because again, I'm not an atheist. I'm just what I've tried to point here. How your argument was faulty. That's all. I mean, if you want to have a conversation about this, we could do that. As you know, I'm not trying to like slam you here. Again, I'd pick you over to Mcrae every day of the weekend, twice on Sunday. As I said, I think you're a good guy. I just think you were incorrect in some of the things you said, and I just made this to correct you, that's all.
And people are buying it. And now he says that I didn't say what I said. I never said there was a consensus, but I did say it was a consensus, but there really wasn't a consensus. And hey, 50% of the papers use it in this way. And I've only read 12. There's 140,000 of them out there. I try to understand why people buy this type of logic. Like, is it me, or is he just bullshitting us? Now, so we can put this argument to bed. One, there is no consensus in philosophy about the definition of the word atheism. And Steve agrees with this.
Consensus, but I've never claimed a consensus.
And there has been no evidence provided by Steve that one definition is more normative than the other. Steve's sample size of 6 to 10 papers nowhere is a large enough sample size to determine the overwhelming academic consensus when there's about 140,000 papers that you can look at that use atheism. So there seems to be a lot of just bad reasoning employed here. So here are my final thoughts. Where do we go from here? First, I think, how did we get to this point where Steve can claim that the consensus in philosophy was something and it was not? That was false. And he had most of us, even myself, believing that was the case. But that's a false claim. How could he now be using a sample size of 6 to 12 papers to tell us how the word is used in philosophy overwhelmingly slow, when I don't think he's sampled or looked at all 140,000 papers to see if there's this overwhelming majority of papers that use it the way he uses it? How did the atheist and skeptic community get here? Now, I think it's because we're still vulnerable to that type of religious thinking, believing the person and not the evidence right in front of our eyes. Now, this is just like a creationist and flat earther. Steve has to twist the truth and twist the science to kind of fit it into their box. And I'll be honest with you, I believe Steve. Yes, I was fooled. How I overcame that was doing a simple Google search, and it exposed the truth for what it was. Think about it. This whole argument is nonsense. Now, if you watch this video to this point, I want to leave you with this. Don't trust me, and don't trust Steve. Look at the evidence for yourself and come to your own conclusions. It goes back to something my grandmother used to always say. A smart man never knows enough, but a fool knows everything. If you like what you've heard, and you agree with me or you disagree with me, consider becoming a member, consider subscribing to the channel, and I'm going to see you next time. But the next time someone says, in philosophy, atheism is belief that no gods exist, and that's the overwhelming consensus, or it's the normative definition, I would like you to laugh, give it a wink, and then send them this video.
Yeah, I agree with you, Nate. It's something that is... again, this wasn't a slam against you. This was just like a correction to some mistakes you made. Now, I think that if this leads to a better conversation, we try to understand philosophy better, all the better for it, I think. And if you want to make a response to this, I welcome it with open arms, and hopefully we can get a conversation going. Anyway, everybody, if you want to leave response below, click subscribe to Nate's channel, and I'll see you next time.